Hello, and welcome to The Sleep Retreat. This podcast will help you relax, unwind, and if you want to, fall asleep. If you're already familiar with the show, feel free to skip ahead to 4 minutes and 30 seconds. If you're new to using a podcast to relax or fall asleep, here is why they work. By simply listening to something other than your own racing thoughts, your mind is offered a well-deserved hiatus. It's a break from all the endless, everyday thinking and processing. And it's all delivered in the form of a moderately captivating narrative, something interesting enough to hold your mind's attention, but also gentle and bland enough to lull you to sleep. Here at the Sleep Retreat, we offer a unique and creative listener experience delivered to you in 2 seamless stages. The first stage is something we call the tuck-in. During this approximately 10-minute segment, I'll be engaging your dreamy imagination and setting you down into an immersive, serene, comfortable space, a place far, far away, perfect for dozing off. And along the way, I'll guide you with simple things you can do to further relax and prepare for pending sleep. After this stage, when we are all tucked in and comfy in this make-believe lullaby land, it's time for the next stage, the drift-off. The drift-off is when we transition together into that sleepy state of slumber. First, we are guided by the somewhat interesting, yet also delightfully monotonous narration of this week's episode, often delivered in the style of an old AM radio or other lo-fi experience. After approximately 45 minutes, the narration concludes, transitioning seamlessly into a 30-minute or longer segment featuring nothing but the continued ambient sounds from our peaceful lullaby land. These soothing background noises range from the rumble of a thunderstorm and the distant calls of seagulls to the steady hum of a car engine, all designed for continued peaceful sleep. Now, it's good to know that it's common with sleep podcasts that it might take 2 or 3 listens before your brain fully sort of trains itself to relax to this show. Once you do, though, just as children love hearing the same bedtime story over and over again, upon return here, you'll find yourself quickly feeling more relaxed and peaceful and diving towards sleep. In this first series, we will feature readings from the Warren Commission report on the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Now, this might sound like an unusual choice for a bedtime story, but believe me, it works. It's a blend of intrigue and at times wonderfully dull narrative, ideal for lulling you to sleep. I should say perhaps that the first few episodes might lean a little more towards the interesting side of the equation, but as the series progresses, they get increasingly monotonous and bland, perfect for sleeping. And you can always jump ahead in the series if you would like. Other stories are coming in the future, and there are several different sleeping environments you can choose from for each episode. Try them out until you find the perfect one for you, or maybe you mix it up from day to day, depending on your mood. If you have any questions or suggestions, send an email to info@porchlightpodcast.network. Now, let's get all settled in at the Sleep Retreat. Okay, let's drift off to sleep. Today you'll be listening and dozing off on a warm afternoon at Grandma and Grandpa's at Gull Harbor. Imagine for a second that you are lying down on a warm futon mattress at one end of a screened-in porch. The porch faces the harbor, the bay, and the ocean on the horizon. The mattress is nestled into a corner and is part of a cozy little reading nook prepared just for kids. There is a little bookshelf there full of comics, magazines, crosswords, and children's books. There are new books and worn-out books. The Hardy Boys, Nancy Drew, books about dinosaurs and horses and sea life, and all kinds of stories about kids getting into summer adventures together. A blue plastic and white transistor radio sits next to a stack of puzzles and board games. A wooden box contains decks of playing cards, dice, jacks, and short little pencils that have been sharpened way too many times. Now, while imagining laying here, let's get nice and relaxed. First, close your eyes and just become aware of your breathing, feeling your chest gently rise and fall again. Next, we will try taking a few deeper breaths. First, filling your lungs with air, then holding it in for 2 or 3 seconds before gently exhaling and letting it all go. Ready? Breathe in deeply, hold for 3, 2, 1, and then exhale. One more time. Breathe in deeply, hold for 3, 2, 1, and exhale. And try thinking to yourself, as I lay here at Gull Harbor, I can feel gravity's pull tugging me gently back towards Earth. With every exhale, I can feel my feet, my ankles, calves, knees, and my legs becoming heavier and more relaxed. Now you can feel the cool, salty ocean air on your skin. It would almost be too cold if it wasn't for the wonderful afternoon sun shining down on you perfectly. The sunlight splatters through the screens and bathes your tanned legs and arms with a soothing warmth, almost as if Grandma has wrapped you up like a cocoon in one of her quilted blankets. Inside the house, the TV is on, and you can hear Grandma and Grandpa moving around after lunch.
To make it difficult for quizmasters? Yes.
You know that they too will soon be taking their afternoon nap in their rooms. But you've got the whole porch to yourself, and your belly feels nice and warm and perfectly satisfied. Today, Grandma made clam chowder and grilled cheese sandwiches. You enjoyed the hot soup and warm, soft cheese, and then you washed it down with a glass of fresh, cold milk. Now, try taking a few more deep breaths. First, filling your lungs with air, holding it there briefly before gently exhaling and letting it all go. Ready? Breathe in deeply, hold for 3, 2, 1, and then exhale. Try continuing on your own, and while doing this, try thinking to yourself, as I lay here, I can feel my body becoming heavier in the cool air and warm sunshine. With each exhale, I can feel my hands and arms and my torso becoming heavier and heavier and more relaxed. You pull out a random book from the bookshelf. This one is called Summer Friends, and on the cover is a picture of a little girl in a red dress with white polka dots. She's sitting in grass with flowers all about, and she's shaking the paw of a bunny rabbit while a white duck looks on and a little frog jumps through the air. You decide that you're just too sleepy to read right now, so you set the book down and lay back and think about the day. It's no wonder you're sleepy and tired. In the morning, after breakfast, Grandma rubbed coconut-scented sunscreen on your face and arms, and then Grandpa took you with him in the old rusty truck to the hardware store. There he drank coffee and laughed with old bearded men wearing high rubber boots. Then you went with him to the docks at the harbor, where he showed you the best place to buy fresh clams, crab, and fish. The docks were bustling with activity. Wooden boats creaked against the tide, fishermen shouted to one another, and the air was thick with the scent of salt water, fresh fish, and diesel. As you continue to breathe deeply and then exhale, try thinking to yourself, as I lay here, my whole body feels heavy and relaxed. With every exhale, I can feel gravity pulling me back towards Earth gently. I can feel my head, my shoulders, my neck becoming relaxed and at ease. And my legs are heavy and at peace with gravity's pull. Now my whole body, my legs and feet, my arms and hands, my torso, my head and neck and shoulders, My whole body is completely at peace, relaxed, and at ease. In the late morning, after coming back to the house with Grandpa, you had borrowed his binoculars and walked up Whalebone Hill, where you could see everything far and wide. The little town of Gull Harbor, the fishing boats and ships at sea, the car ferry full of tourists headed to the islands, the seagulls, and kids riding bikes and scooters along the streets below. Then, up on Whalebone Hill, you had finally flown your brand new kite, a beautiful purple kite with a long white tail. It climbed higher and higher and higher through the coastal winds, tugging on your tired arms like a heavy fish on the end of the line. But now, so drowsy, laying under the sun on the porch, after a long morning of adventures in the crisp, fresh coastal air, you pick up the transistor radio and dial into a random station.
The exact time of the assassination was fixed by the testimony of 4 witnesses. Special Agent Rufus W. Youngblood observed that the large electric sign clock atop the Texas School Book Depository
And then you set the radio down, lay back, and close your eyes.
North on Houston Street a few seconds before the shots were fired. Just prior to the shooting, David F. Powers, riding in the Secret Service follow-up car, remarked to Kenneth O'Donnell that it was 12:30 p.m., the time they were due at the Trade Mart. Seconds after the shooting, Roy Kellerman, riding in the front seat of the presidential limousine, looked at his watch and said 12:30 to the driver, Special Agent Greer. The Dallas Police radio log reflects that Chief of Police Curry reported the shooting of the president and issued his initial orders at 12:30 p.m. William Greer, operator of the presidential limousine, estimated the car's speed at the time of the first shot as 12 to 15 miles per hour. Other witnesses in the motorcade estimated the speed of the president's limousine from 7 to 22 miles per hour. A more precise determination has been made from motion pictures taken on the scene by an amateur photographer, Abraham Zapruder. The car maintained this average speed over a distance of approximately 186 feet, immediately preceding the shot, which struck the president. While the car traveled this distance, the Zapruder camera ran 152 frames. Since the camera operates at a speed of 18.3 frames per second, it was calculated that the car required 8.3 seconds to cover the 136 feet. This represents a speed of 11.2 miles per hour. Mrs. John F. Kennedy, on the left of the rear seat of the limousine, looked toward her left and waved to the crowds along the route. Soon after the motorcade turned on Elm Street, she heard a sound similar to a motorcycle noise and a cry from Governor Connolly, which caused her to look to her right. On turning, she saw a quizzical look on her husband's face as he raised his left hand to his throat. As she cradled her mortally wounded husband, Mrs. Kennedy said, "Oh my God, they have shot my husband. I love you, Jack." Governor Connolly testified that he recognized the first noise as a rifle shot, and the thought immediately crossed his mind that it was an assassination attempt. From his position in the right jump seat immediately in front of the president, he instinctively turned to his right because the shot appeared to come from over his right shoulder. Unable to see the president as he turned to the right, the governor started to look back over his left shoulder, but he never completed the turn because he felt something strike him in the back. In his testimony before the commission, Governor Connolly was certain that he was hit by the second shot, which he stated he did not hear. Mrs. Connolly, too, heard a frightening noise from her right. Looking over her right shoulder, she saw that the president had both hands at his neck, but she observed no blood and heard nothing. She watched as he slumped down with an empty expression on his face. Roy Kellerman, in the right front seat of the limousine, heard a report like a firecracker pop. Turning to his right in the direction of the noise, Kellerman heard the president say, "My God, I'm hit." Kellerman grabbed his microphone and radioed ahead to the lead car. He said, "We are hit. Get us to the hospital immediately." The driver, William Greer, heard a noise which he took to be a backfire from one of the motorcycles flanking the presidential car. When he heard the same noise again, Greer glanced over his shoulder and saw Governor Connolly fall. At the sound of the second shot, he realized that something was wrong, and he pressed down on the accelerator as Kellerman said, "Get out of here, fast." As he issued his instructions to Greer and to the lead car, Kellerman heard a flurry of shots. Looking back from the front seat, Kellerman saw Governor Connolly in his wife's lap and Special Agent Clinton J. Hill lying across the trunk of the car. Mrs. Connolly heard a second shot fired and pulled her husband down into her lap. The governor was lying with his head on his wife's lap when he heard a shot hit the president. According to Governor and Mrs. Connolly, it was after this shot that Kellerman issued his emergency instructions and the car accelerated. From the left front running board of the president's follow-up car, Special Agent Hill was scanning the few people standing on the south side of Elm Street after the motorcade had turned off Houston Street. He estimated that the motorcade had slowed down to approximately 9 or 10 miles per hour on the turn at the intersection of Houston and Elm Streets, and then proceeded at a rate of 12 to 15 miles per hour, with the follow-up car trailing the president's automobile by approximately 5 feet. Hill heard a noise, which seemed to be a firecracker, coming from his right rear. He immediately looked to his right and saw President Kennedy grab at himself and lurch forward and to the left. Hill jumped from the follow-up car and ran to the president's automobile. At about the time he reached the president's automobile, Hill heard a second shot. At the instant that Hill stepped onto the left rear step of the president's automobile and grasped the handhold, the car lurched forward, causing him to lose his footing. He ran 3 or 4 steps, regained his position, and mounted the car. Between the time he originally seized the handhold and the time he mounted the car, Hill recalled, Mrs. Kennedy had jumped up from the seat and was, it appeared to me, reaching for something coming off the rear bumper of the car when she noticed that I was trying to climb on the car. She turned toward me and I grabbed her and put her back in the back seat, crawled up on top of the back seat, and lay there. David Powers, who witnessed the scene from the president's follow-up car, stated that Mrs. Kennedy would probably have fallen off the rear end of the car and been killed if Agent Hill had not pushed her back into the presidential automobile. Special Agent Reedy, on the right front running board of the presidential follow-up car, heard noises that sounded like firecrackers and ran toward the president's limousine. But he was immediately called back by Special Agent Emery Roberts, in charge of the follow-up car, who did not believe that he could reach the president's car at the speed it was then traveling. Special Agent George W. Hickey, in the rear seat of the presidential follow-up car, picked up and cocked an automatic rifle as he heard the last shot. At this point, the cars were speeding through the underpass and had left the scene of the shooting, but Hickey kept the automatic weapon ready as the car raced to the hospital. Most of the other Secret Service agents in the motorcade had drawn their sidearms. Roberts noticed that the vice president's car was approximately 1/2 block behind the presidential follow-up car at the time of the shooting and signaled for it to move in closer. Directing the security detail for the vice president from the right front seat of the vice presidential car, Special Agent Youngblood recalled. As we were beginning to go down this incline, all of a sudden there was an explosive noise. I quickly observed unnatural movement of crowds, like ducking or scattering, and quick movements in the presidential follow-up car. So I turned around and hit the vice president on the shoulder and hollered, "Get down," and then looked around again and saw more of this movement. And so I proceeded to go to the back seat and get on top of him. Youngblood was not positive that he was in the rear seat before the second shot, but thought it probable because of President Johnson's statement to that effect immediately after the assassination. President Johnson emphasized Youngblood's instantaneous reaction after the first shot. I was startled by the sharp report or explosion, but I had no time to speculate as to its origin, because Agent Youngblood turned in a flash, immediately after the first explosion, hitting me on the shoulder, and shouted to all of us in the back seat to get down. I was pushed down by Agent Youngblood. Almost in the same moment in which he hit or pushed me, he vaulted over the back seat and sat on me. I was bent over under the weight of Agent Youngblood's body toward Mrs. Johnson and Senator Yarborough. Clifton C. Carter, riding in the vice president's follow-up car a short distance behind, reported that Youngblood was in the rear seat, using his body to shield the vice president before the second and third shots were fired. Other Secret Service agents assigned to the motorcade remained at their posts during the race to the hospital. None stayed at the scene of the shooting, and none entered the Texas School Book Depository building at or immediately after the shooting. Secret Service procedure requires that each agent stay with the person being protected and not be diverted unless it is necessary to accomplish the protective assignment. Forrest Sorrells, special agent in charge of the Dallas office, was the first Secret Service agent to return to the scene of the assassination, approximately 20 or 25 minutes after the shots were fired. In the final instant of the assassination, the presidential motorcade began a race to Parkland Memorial Hospital, approximately 4 miles from the Texas School Book Depository building. On receipt of the radio message from Kellerman to the lead car that the president had been hit, Chief of Police Curry and police motorcyclists at the head of the motorcade led the way to the hospital. Meanwhile, Chief Curry ordered the police base station to notify Parkland Hospital that the wounded president was en route. The radio log of the Dallas Police Department shows that at 12:30 p.m., Chief Curry radioed, "Go to the hospital, Parkland Hospital, have them stand by." A moment later, Curry added, "Looks like the president has been hit. Have Parkland stand by." The base station replied, "They have been notified." Traveling at speeds estimated at times to be up to 70 or 80 miles per hour down the Stemmons Freeway and Harry Hines Boulevard, the presidential limousine arrived at the emergency entrance of the Parkland Hospital at about 12:35 p.m. Arriving almost simultaneously were the president's follow-up car, the vice president's automobile, and the vice president's follow-up car. Admiral Berkeley, the president's physician, arrived at the hospital between 3 and 5 minutes following the arrival of the president, since the riders in his car were not exactly aware what had happened, and the car went on to the Trade Mart first. When Parkland Hospital received the notification, the staff in the emergency area was alerted, and trauma rooms 1 and 2 were prepared. These rooms were for the emergency treatment of acutely ill or injured patients. Although the first message mentioned an injury only to President Kennedy, 2 rooms were prepared. As the president's limousine sped toward the hospital, 12 doctors were present at the emergency area. Surgeons, Doctors Malcolm O. Perry, Charles R. Baxter, Robert N. McClelland, Ronald C. Jones, the chief neurologist, Dr. William Kemp Clark, 4 anesthesiologists, Doctors Marion T. Jenkins, Adolph H. Giesecke, Jr., Jackie H. Hunt, Gene C. Akin, urological surgeon, Dr. Paul C. Peters, an oral surgeon, Dr. Don T. Curtis, and a heart specialist, Dr. Fuad A. Bashur. Upon arriving at Parkland Hospital, Lawson jumped from the lead car and rushed into the emergency entrance, where he was met by hospital staff members wheeling stretchers out to the automobile. Special Agent Hill removed his suit jacket and covered the president's head and upper chest to prevent the taking of photographs. Governor Connolly, who had lost consciousness on the ride to the hospital, regained consciousness when the limousine stopped abruptly at the emergency entrance. Despite his serious wounds, Governor Connolly tried to get out of the way so that medical help could reach the president. Although he was reclining in his wife's arms, he lurched forward in an effort to stand upright and get out of the car, but he collapsed again. Then he experienced his first sensation of pain. The governor was lifted onto a stretcher and taken into Trauma Room 2. For a moment, Mrs. Kennedy refused to release the president, whom she held in her lap. But then Kellerman, Greer, and Lawson lifted the president onto a stretcher and pushed it into Trauma Room 1. The first physician to see the president at Parkland Hospital was Dr. Charles J. Carrico, a resident in general surgery. Dr. Carrico was in the emergency area, examining another patient when he was notified that President Kennedy was en route to the hospital. Approximately 2 minutes later, Dr. Carrico saw the president on his back, being wheeled into the emergency area. He noted that the president was blue-white or ashen in color, had slow, spasmodic, agonal respiration without any coordination, made no voluntary movements, had his eyes open with the pupils dilated without any reaction to light, evidenced no palpable pulse, and had a few chest sounds, which were thought to be heartbeats. On the basis of these findings, Dr. Carrico concluded that President Kennedy was still alive. Dr. Carrico noted 2 wounds, a small bullet wound in the front lower neck and an extensive wound in the president's head. Dr. Carrico felt the president's back and determined that there was no large wound there, which would be an immediate threat to life. Observing the serious problems presented by the head wound and inadequate respiration, Dr. Carrico directed his attention to improving the president's breathing. He noted contusions, hematoma to the right of the larynx, which was deviated slightly to the left, and also ragged tissue which indicated a tracheal injury. Dr. Carrico inserted a cuffed endotracheal tube past the injury, inflated the cuff, and connected it to a Bennett machine to assist in respiration. At that point, direction of the president's treatment was undertaken by Dr. Malcolm O. Perry, who arrived at Trauma Room 1 a few moments after the president. Dr. Perry noted the president's back brace as he felt for a femoral pulse, which he did not find. Observing that an effective airway had to be established if treatment was to be effective, Dr. Perry performed a tracheotomy, which required 3 to 5 minutes. While Dr. Perry was performing the tracheotomy, Drs. Carrico and Ronald Jones made cut downs on the president's right leg and left arm to infuse blood and fluids into the circulatory system. Dr. Carrico treated the president's known adrenal insufficiency by administering hydrocortisone. Dr. Robert N. McClellan entered at that point and assisted Dr. Perry with the tracheotomy. Dr. Bashauer, Chief of Cardiology, Dr. Jenkins, Chief of Anesthesiology, and Dr. Giesecke then joined in the effort to revive the president. When Dr. Perry noted free air and blood in the president's chest cavity, he asked that chest tubes be inserted to allow for drainage of blood and air. Drs. Peters and Baxter initiated these procedures. As a result of the infusion of liquids through the cut-downs, the cardiac massage, and the airway, the doctors were able to maintain peripheral circulation as monitored at the neck artery and at the wrist. A femoral pulse was also detected in the president's leg. While these medical efforts were in progress, Dr. Clark noted some electrical activity on the cardio tachyscope attached to monitor the president's heart responses. In the absence of any neurological, muscular, or heart response, the doctors concluded that efforts to revive the president were hopeless. This was verified by Admiral Berkeley, the president's physician, who arrived at the hospital after emergency treatment was underway, and concluded that my direct services to him at that moment would have interfered with the action of the team which was in progress. At approximately 1 p.m., after last rites were administered to the president by Father Oscar L. Huber, Dr. Clark pronounced the president dead. The time was fixed at 1 p.m. as an approximation, since it was impossible to determine the precise moment when life left the president. President Kennedy could have survived the neck injury, but the head wound was fatal. From a medical viewpoint, President Kennedy was alive when he arrived at Parkland Hospital. The doctors observed that he had a heartbeat and was making some respiratory efforts, but his condition was hopeless, and the extraordinary efforts of the doctors to save him could not help but to have been unavailing. Since the Dallas doctors directed all their efforts to controlling the massive bleeding caused by the head wound and to reconstructing an airway to his lungs, the president remained on his back throughout his medical treatment at Parkland. When asked why he did not turn the president over, Dr. Carrico testified as follows. This man was in obvious extreme distress, and any more thorough inspection would have involved several minutes, considerable time, which at this juncture was not available. A thorough inspection would have involved washing and cleansing the back, and this is not practical in treating an acutely injured patient. You have to determine which things which are immediately life-threatening and cope with them before attempting to evaluate the full extent of the injuries. Did you ever have occasion to look at the president's back? No, sir. In trying to treat an acutely injured patient, you have to establish an airway, adequate ventilation, and you have to establish adequate circulation. Before this was accomplished, the president's cardiac activity had ceased, and closed cardiac massage was instituted, which made it impossible to inspect his back. Moreover, the Parkland doctors took no further action after the president had expired because they concluded that it was beyond the scope of their permissible duties. While one medical team tried to revive President Kennedy, a second performed a series of operations on the bullet wounds sustained by Governor Connolly. Governor Connolly was originally seen by Dr. Carrico and Dr. Richard Dulaney. While Dr. Carrico went on to attend the president, Dr. Dulaney stayed with the governor and was soon joined by several other doctors. At approximately 12:45 p.m., Dr. Robert Shaw, Chief of Thoracic Surgery, arrived at Trauma Room 2 to take charge of the care of Governor Connolly, whose major wound fell within Dr. Shaw's area of specialization. Governor Connolly had a large wound in the front of the right chest, which caused extreme pain and difficulty in breathing. Rubber tubes were inserted between the second and third ribs to expand the right lung, which had collapsed because of the opening in the chest wall. After Governor Connolly had been moved to the operating room, Dr. Shaw started the first operation by cutting away the edges of the wound on the front of the governor's chest and suturing the damaged lung and lacerated muscles. From approximately 4 p.m. to 4:50 p.m., Dr. Charles F. Gregory, Chief of Orthopedic Surgery, operated on the wounds of Governor Connolly's right wrist, assisted by Doctors William Osborne and John Parker. The wound on the back of the wrist was left partially open for draining, and the wound on the palm side was enlarged, cleansed, and closed. While the second operation was in progress, Dr. George T. Shires, assisted by Doctors Robert McClelland, Charles Baxter, and Ralph Don Patman, treated the gunshot wound in the left thigh. This punctuate missile wound, about 2/5 inch in diameter and located approximately 5 inches above the left knee, was cleansed and closed with sutures. But a small metallic fragment remained in the governor's leg. As President Kennedy and Governor Connally were being removed from the limousine onto stretchers, a protective circle of Secret Service agents surrounded Vice President and Mrs. Johnson and escorted them into Parkland Hospital through the emergency entrance. The agents moved a nurse and patient out of a nearby room, lowered the shades, and took emergency security measures to protect the Vice President. 2 men from the President's follow-up car were detailed to help protect the Vice President. An agent was stationed at the entrance to stop anyone who was not a member of the presidential party. U.S. Representatives Henry B. Gonzalez, Jack Brooks, Homer Thornberry, and Albert Thomas joined Clifton C. Carter and the group of special agents protecting the Vice President. On one occasion, Mrs. Johnson, accompanied by 2 Secret Service agents, left the room to see Mrs. Kennedy and Mrs. Connally. Concern that the Vice President might also be a target for assassination prompted the Secret Service agents to urge him to leave the hospital and return to Washington immediately. The Vice President decided to wait until he received definitive word of the President's condition. At approximately 1:20 p.m., Vice President Johnson was notified by O'Donnell that President Kennedy was dead. Special Agent Youngblood learned from Mrs. Johnson the location of her 2 daughters and made arrangements through Secret Service headquarters in Washington to provide them with protection immediately. When consulted by the Vice President, O'Donnell advised him to go to the airfield immediately and return to Washington. It was decided that the Vice President should return on the presidential plane rather than on the Vice Presidential plane because it had better communication equipment. The Vice President conferred with White House Assistant Press Secretary Malcolm Kilduff and decided that there would be no release of the news of the President's death until the Vice President had left the hospital. When told that Mrs. Kennedy refused to leave without the President's body, the Vice President said that he would not leave Dallas without her. On the recommendation of the Secret Service agents, Vice President Johnson decided to board the presidential airplane, Air Force One, and wait for Mrs. Kennedy and the President's body. Immediately after President Kennedy's stretcher was wheeled into Trauma Room 1, Secret Service agents took positions at the door of the small emergency room. A nurse was asked to identify hospital personnel and to tell everyone, except necessary medical staff members, to leave the emergency room. Other Secret Service agents posted themselves in the corridors and other areas near the emergency room. Special Agent Lawson made certain that the Dallas police kept the public and press away from the immediate area of the hospital. Agents Kellerman and Hill telephoned the head of the White House detail, Gerald A. Bain, to advise him of the assassination. The telephone line to Washington was kept open throughout the remainder of the stay at the hospital. Secret Service agents stationed at later stops on the President's itinerary of November 22nd were redeployed. Men at the Trade Mart were driven to Parkland Hospital in Dallas police cars. The Secret Service group awaiting the President in Austin were instructed to return to Washington. Meanwhile, the Secret Service agents in charge of security at Love Field started to make arrangements for departure. As soon as one of the agents learned of the shooting, he asked the officer in charge of the police detail at the airport to institute strict security measures for the presidential aircraft, the airport terminal, and the surrounding area. Secret Service agents working with police cleared the areas adjacent to the aircraft, including warehouses, other terminal buildings, and the neighboring parking lots of all people. When security arrangements at the airport were complete, the Secret Service made the necessary arrangements for the Vice President to leave the hospital. Unmarked police cars took the Vice President and Mrs. Johnson from Parkland Hospital to Love Field. Chief Curry drove one automobile occupied by Vice President Johnson, U.S. Representatives Thomas and Thornberry, and Special Agent Youngblood. In another car, Mrs. Johnson was driven to the airport, accompanied by Secret Service agents and Representative Brooks. Motorcade policemen who escorted the automobiles were requested by the Vice President and Agent Youngblood not to use sirens. During the drive, Vice President Johnson, at Youngblood's instruction, kept below window level. While the team of doctors at Parkland Hospital tried desperately to save the life of President Kennedy, Mrs. Kennedy alternated between watching them and waiting outside. After the president was pronounced dead, O'Donnell tried to persuade Mrs. Kennedy to leave the area, but she refused. She said that she intended to stay with her husband. A casket was obtained, and the president's body was prepared for removal. Before the body could be taken from the hospital, 2 Dallas officials informed members of the president's staff that the body could not be removed from the city until an autopsy was performed. Despite the protests of these officials, the casket was wheeled out of the hospital, placed in an ambulance, and transported to the airport shortly after 2 p.m. At approximately 2:15 p.m., the casket was loaded onto the rear of the presidential plane, where seats had been removed to make room. Concerned that the local officials might try to prevent the plane's departure, O'Donnell asked that the pilot take off immediately. He was informed that takeoff would be delayed until Vice President Johnson was sworn in. From the presidential airplane, the Vice President telephoned Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, who advised that Mr. Johnson take the presidential oath of office before the plane left Dallas. Federal Judge Sarah T. Hughes hastened to the plane to administer the oath. Members of the presidential and vice presidential parties filled the central compartment of the plane to witness the swearing in. At 2:38 p.m., Lyndon B. Johnson took the oath of office as the 36th President of the United States. Mrs. Kennedy and Mrs. Johnson stood at the side of the new president as he took the oath of office. 9 minutes later, the presidential airplane departed for Washington, D.C. On the return flight, Mrs. Kennedy sat with David Powers, Kenneth O'Donnell, and Lawrence O'Brien. At 5:58 p.m. EST, Air Force One landed at Andrews AFB, where President Kennedy had begun his last trip only 31 hours before. Detailed security arrangements had been made by radio from the president's plane on the return flight. The public had been excluded from the base, and only government officials and the press were permitted near the landing area. Upon arrival, President Johnson made a brief statement over television and radio. President and Mrs. Johnson were flown by helicopter to the White House, from where Mrs. Johnson was driven to her residence under Secret Service escort. The president then walked to the executive office building, where he worked until 9 p.m.